The room went completely silent when the CEO pointed at the single father standing near the back wall and laughed in front of nearly 200 employees. She had just called him an embarrassment to the company, a man who had probably wandered into the wrong building wearing an old work jacket and carrying a faded lunch bag. But before the humiliation could sink any deeper, the glass doors at the far end of the conference hall opened, and the company's most respected lead engineer walked in, stopped dead in his tracks, and stared at the man as if he had just seen a ghost. Then, with tears suddenly gathering in his eyes, he crossed the entire room and called him one word that made the CEO's face lose all its color: Professor. If you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a person's life, please like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you can remain part of our family and our community. The man's name was Everett Hale, a 46-year-old single father who had spent the last 8 years raising his 12-year-old daughter, Clara, alone. He lived in a small rented house on the edge of the city, where the paint on the porch was peeling, the kitchen window stuck whenever the weather changed, and the refrigerator sometimes made a strange humming sound that Everett had learned to ignore. His clothes were clean but old. His shoes had been repaired twice. His battered lunch bag had belonged to his late wife, Marissa, who had died years earlier after a long illness, leaving Everett with a broken heart and a child who was too young to understand why her mother would never walk through the front door again. Everett had once been a brilliant professor of mechanical engineering, the kind of teacher whose students stayed after class simply because they wanted to understand one more idea. He had published research that had influenced modern industrial robotics, designed systems that had saved manufacturing companies millions of dollars, and mentored young engineers who later became leaders in their fields. But after Marissa became ill, Everett walked away from his university position because he wanted to spend every possible moment beside her and then beside Clara. He never regretted it. To him, being a father had become more important than being famous. On that particular morning, Everett had come to the headquarters of Veyron Dynamics because Clara's school needed an expensive science program fee by the end of the week, and he had recently taken temporary repair work wherever he could find it. A former student had told him that Veyron was searching for someone who could diagnose a serious problem with one of its prototype robotic systems. Everett had not come expecting a job. He had simply come hoping to earn enough money to keep Clara's dream alive. She wanted to become an engineer like her mother and father, and Everett had promised that no matter how difficult life became, he would never let her believe poverty meant she had to abandon her dreams. Veyron Dynamics was one of the fastest-growing engineering companies in the country, led by 38-year-old CEO Celeste Whitmore. Celeste was brilliant, ambitious, and feared by almost everyone around her. She had taken control of the company after her father retired and had transformed it from a modest technology firm into a global corporation. Investors praised her instincts. Magazines called her ruthless in a flattering way. Employees knew better. Celeste demanded perfection, and anyone who embarrassed her was quickly removed from the building. She believed appearances mattered because she had spent her entire life fighting to prove that she belonged in rooms where powerful people once dismissed her. That morning, the company was preparing to unveil a revolutionary robotic navigation system that could potentially secure a billion-dollar government contract. The entire executive team had gathered for the final demonstration. Everett had been directed toward the engineering floor after mentioning that he might be able to help with the malfunctioning prototype. Unfortunately, an assistant misunderstood his role and allowed him into the main conference room while the executives were preparing. Celeste saw him standing near the back and immediately assumed he was a maintenance worker. She asked why he was there, and Everett calmly explained that he had been invited to examine the navigation system. Instead of listening, Celeste looked him up and down. His jacket was faded. His shoes were worn. His lunch bag was old. He looked nothing like the polished consultants who normally entered her building. With dozens of employees watching, Celeste sarcastically suggested that perhaps he had mistaken Veyron Dynamics for a community repair shop. A few nervous people laughed because they were afraid not to. Everett lowered his eyes, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew humiliation could become cruel when challenged in front of a crowd. Celeste continued, saying that the company had spent years developing advanced robotics and could not afford to let random people with outdated tools interfere with million-dollar equipment. Everett quietly reached into his pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper covered in handwritten equations. He explained that he had noticed something unusual in the prototype's movement pattern from across the room. The machine was compensating for a calibration error that had been introduced into its predictive model. If they ran the demonstration as planned, the robot would eventually miscalculate its position and potentially destroy the prototype environment. Celeste smiled coldly and told him that if his understanding of advanced engineering were as impressive as he seemed to think, perhaps he would not be carrying his belongings in a lunch bag. The room fell silent again. Everett looked at her for a long moment. There was sadness in his expression, but no anger. He simply folded the paper and said that he had only come to help. Then he turned toward the door. Before he could take another step, the conference doors opened. Dr. Adrian Mercer, Veyron's lead engineer, rushed inside carrying a tablet. Adrian was 43, respected across the industry, and famous for designing the very navigation architecture that had made Veyron's new robotic system possible. He had been delayed at another building that morning and had only just arrived. His eyes moved across the room until they landed on Everett. He froze. The tablet nearly slipped from his hand. Adrian walked forward slowly, staring at the man he had not seen in more than 20 years. Then he whispered, with a voice filled with disbelief and emotion, "Professor Hale." The room seemed to stop breathing. Celeste's confident expression disappeared. Adrian approached Everett with tears in his eyes and embraced him like a son greeting the father who had once believed in him when nobody else did. He explained that Everett had been the professor who discovered his talent when Adrian was struggling through university. Everett had stayed late after classes to teach him advanced systems engineering. When Adrian nearly dropped out because he could not afford tuition, Everett had secretly arranged research work for him and personally recommended him for a scholarship. Adrian told everyone that the robotic navigation architecture Veyron was about to demonstrate was based partly on research Everett had pioneered decades earlier. In fact, Adrian had spent the last 15 years trying to build upon the mathematical model his former professor had created. The man standing before them was not an ordinary repair worker. He was one of the minds who had helped shape the field. But Adrian was not finished. He opened his tablet and showed the engineering team the system logs. Everett had been right. The navigation algorithm contained a subtle synchronization error. It had not been discovered because the malfunction only appeared under a very specific combination of temperature, load, and movement speed. If they had demonstrated the prototype that afternoon under the planned conditions, the robot could have crashed into the testing structure, destroying millions of dollars of equipment and possibly injuring several people. Everett had noticed it in less than 10 minutes. The same man Celeste had mocked had just saved her company from disaster. Nobody laughed now. Celeste stood motionless, staring at the equations Everett had written on the folded paper. The humiliation she had inflicted on him suddenly felt enormous. She remembered every word she had spoken and every nervous laugh from the employees around her. She had judged a man by his clothes because she had forgotten that success did not always wear a suit. Yet Everett did something nobody expected. He did not demand an apology. He did not humiliate Celeste in return. Instead, he asked Adrian whether the engineering team had the resources needed to correct the problem. When Adrian said they could fix it but needed additional testing time, Everett nodded and offered to stay and help. Celeste looked at him, confused by his generosity. The truth was that Everett understood something Celeste did not yet understand. Pride could protect a person for a moment, but forgiveness could change a life. As the engineers gathered around the prototype, Everett worked quietly beside Adrian. He explained the problem with remarkable patience, never once mentioning Celeste's earlier insult. Younger engineers watched him with admiration. He answered their questions, corrected their calculations gently, and encouraged them when they made mistakes. He did not behave like someone trying to prove that he was the smartest person in the room. He behaved like a teacher. That afternoon, the prototype successfully completed its demonstration. The government representatives were impressed. The contract remained possible. Veyron had avoided a catastrophic failure. But the biggest transformation was happening inside Celeste. She eventually approached Everett while the engineers were packing up. For perhaps the first time in her career, she looked genuinely uncertain. She admitted that she had judged him unfairly. She confessed that she had become so obsessed with protecting her company's reputation that she had started believing people were only valuable if they looked successful. She told Everett that she had been afraid of losing everything she had built, and that fear had made her cruel. Everett listened. Then he told her something that stayed with her long after he left the building. He said that losing everything had taught him that the things people wear, the cars they drive, and the titles printed on their business cards are temporary. What remains is how people treat someone who has nothing to offer them. Celeste lowered her head and apologized sincerely. Everett accepted. But there was another surprise waiting. Adrian had discovered that Everett had been working temporary jobs because he had never returned to academia after caring for his family. He asked Everett whether he would consider joining Veyron as a senior research advisor and mentor. Everett hesitated. He worried about leaving Clara alone and feared that after so many years away from the industry, he might no longer belong. Adrian reminded him that he had never stopped belonging. So Everett accepted a part-time position that allowed him to work during school hours and return home every afternoon. His first major project was not designing a machine. It was establishing a mentorship program for young engineers who came from difficult financial backgrounds. Celeste supported the program personally. Months later, the program became one of Veyron's most respected initiatives. Students who once believed engineering was only for wealthy families began receiving scholarships, mentorship, and opportunities to work alongside experienced professionals. Everett became known throughout the company not as the man who had saved the prototype, but as the professor who reminded everyone why technology should ultimately serve people. One afternoon, Everett brought Clara to Veyron's engineering laboratory. She stood beside her father, staring at the machines with wide eyes. Adrian greeted her warmly and showed her the prototype that her father had helped save. Celeste joined them and handed Clara a small notebook containing the first page of the company's new scholarship program. Clara looked at her father, confused. Everett smiled. Celeste explained that the scholarship would carry Marissa's name and would help young students pursue engineering when financial hardship threatened to stop them. Everett could not speak for several seconds. His eyes filled with tears. He had spent years believing that losing his career was the price he had paid for being there for his family. But standing beside Clara, he finally realized that his life had not been ruined. It had simply taken a different path. The greatest thing he had built was not a machine. It was a daughter who still believed in dreams. A student who became a brilliant engineer. A company that learned to look beyond appearances. And a second chance offered to a woman who had once humiliated him in front of everyone. Before Everett left the building that afternoon, Celeste thanked him again. She told him that he had taught her something no leadership course ever had. Greatness was not measured by how many people stood when you entered a room, but by whether you were willing to help someone stand when life had pushed them down. Everett smiled and looked toward Clara, who was waiting near the entrance with her backpack. He told Celeste that everyone deserves a second chance, especially the people who are strong enough to admit when they were wrong. Then he took his daughter's hand and walked outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. Behind them, the doors of Veyron Dynamics remained open. Not because of a billionaire. Not because of a powerful CEO. But because one tired father in an old jacket had walked into a room where people judged him by what they saw, and he quietly reminded them that a person's worth can never be measured by appearances. And sometimes, the greatest comeback in life does not begin with proving someone wrong. It begins with refusing to become bitter. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a meaningful comment telling us this: would you have forgiven Celeste if you were in Everett's place? Sometimes the people who hurt us teach us the lessons we never knew we needed, and sometimes the greatest victory is not revenge, but becoming the kind of person who chooses kindness even after being treated without it. Everett walked into that building carrying an old lunch bag, but he walked out carrying something far more valuable, the knowledge that his kindness had never been wasted. His career had changed, his life had changed, and the world around him had changed, but the heart that made him a great professor and a devoted father had never needed a title to prove its worth.